Hello and welcome back to the Bookshelf Odyssey. And today we are covering part 3 of Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Part 3 is called Burning Bright, and the figure of fire really comes into play in this final section. I apologize, it's taken me so long to get the next section out. As I mentioned, we were on vacation, then we had some work that had to be done on the house, and then I've just been having a hard time finding time that's quiet at a place that's quiet to get this recorded. So I will be recording both parts of part 3. So get yourself a cup of coffee and we will dive in. Today I'm drinking from my fall cup. It says "Hello Pumpkin" on it, and I got that from Hobby Lobby. I am drinking some pumpkin spice latte coffee, and just to kind of set the mood for fall, as Bradbury goes so perfectly with this time of year. But okay, we're going to start on Burning Bright. Montag is responding to a fire call with Beatty and the crew, and we left off with Montag realizing that they had pulled up in front of his own house. And it begins with this paragraph. Lights flicked on and house doors opened all down the street to watch the carnival set up. Montag and Beatty stared, one with dry satisfaction, the other with disbelief, at the house before them, this main ring in which torches would be juggled and fire eaten. And I love that Bradbury is using the carnival imagery to describe what's happening, because this is what happens, right? When there's any kind of police activity or ambulance or fire, whatever it is that happens on your street, the neighbors always come running out and, want to watch and see what's happening. And Bradbury is describing this as a carnival setup. It's like they're play acting. They're putting on an illusion, a show for the neighborhood to remind them who's in charge and what's happened and who has the power and the authority. Beatty mocks Montag with when he's talking about Clarice. He brings up Clarice and says, "Oh no, you weren't fooled by that little idiot's routine, now were you? Flowers, butterflies, leaves, sunsets. It's all in her file." He goes on to say, "Look at that sick look on your face. A few grass blades in the quarters of the moon. What trash. What good did she ever do with all that?" And that is a really good question. But it's hard to know what good she did with all that, since her life was cut short by society, by a society that thought it was fine to drive recklessly and carelessly through a city with no care or concern for anybody else's life but their own. But I think she has done good, even in spite of her Clarice's death, because what she imprinted on Montag helped push him over the edge where we find him here. And in fact, Montag says, she saw everything. She didn't do anything to anyone. She just let them alone. And then Mildred comes out, and Montag realizes that Mildred was the one who turned in the alarm. And all she cares about is her poor family, the video family on the walls, that really, they have no care for her at all. And that's what she ended up caring with. She jumps in their car and just blasts away out of Montag's life. And then Montag is reminded that Faber is still in his ear. And I love how this is described. The brush of a death's head moth against a cold black screen. "Montag, this is Faber. Do you hear me? What's happening?" Just again, Bradbury showing the powers of his ability to paint a picture. Especially in the Midwest where I live, we hear this happening all the time. Is bugs bouncing against your screen, on a warm summer night. Even at times in the late fall, they'll still be out there and they're attracted by the light, and they'll come and just whisper and bump against the screen, and you wonder if you're hearing things or not. So Faber's his voice is kind of like that little whisper of an insect against the screen. Beatty has a speech here I want to read because I find this interesting. He talks about fire. In this section, we'll have some action to it, but there's a lot of philosophizing. There's a lot of philosophy as well. But he says, "What is there about fire that's so lovely? No matter what age we are, what draws us to it? Beatty blew out the flame and lit it again, and that's on his lighter. He says, it's perpetual motion, the thing man wanted to invent but never did, or almost perpetual motion. If you let it go on, it'd burn our lifetimes out. What is fire? It's a mystery. Scientists give us gobbledygook about friction and molecules, but they don't really know. Its real beauty is that it destroys responsibility and consequences. A problem gets too burdensome, then into the furnace with it. Now, Montag, you're a burden, and fire will lift you off my shoulders, clean, quick, sure, nothing to rot later, antibiotic, aesthetic, practical. Beatty describes fire as something that destroys responsibility and consequences. And they have all these books and they're just burning them into the fire with them. It destroys the responsibility for the knowledge in those books, and it destroys the thing that is maybe causing conflict or people to question, people to think, well, let's just burn it, get rid of it, and then we won't have to worry about it. So he gives Montag the responsibility, Beatty does, to give Montag the responsibility to burn his own house down, and he does. And he burns the books. He's just like going a little crazy. And, Beatty says, I kind of chuckle at this line. He says, when you're quite finished, said Beatty behind him, you're under arrest. And so then what happens next is Beatty then turns the fire on, Montag turns the fire onto Beatty and burns him and uses that tool to help him escape. And so is Montag trying to burn away his own responsibilities too by burning Beatty? He's freeing himself from the responsibility now that he has, or the consequences that he has for hiding and reading a book. I thought that was interesting how he turned fire against the firemen. But I want to talk a minute about censorship and this kind of ongoing conversation that this book has had about it, and how quickly this society showed themselves that if there was something that was made them uncomfortable, they would burn it and get rid of it. And I think one of the books referenced was Uncle Tom's Cabin. Books like that, this makes us uncomfortable. Let's just get rid of it, instead of wrestling with the ideas and the thoughts and the philosophy in the book. It would be just far easier to burn it and forget about it. And this is why, I am against censorship, because it's for several reasons. One, it's far too easy for somebody to say, I don't like what you're saying, but what I say is fine. And I want the right for me to be able to keep saying what I'm saying, but I don't want the right for you to say what you're saying. Unless there's some obvious harm that it would bring people. But even then, I want to approach this very carefully. And I don't know if I'm eloquent enough to speak on this issue, honestly, but and I acknowledge that I speak from a position of privilege, because I've never had anyone try to censor my speech, and I'm grateful for that. And I want that same freedom for others, even if what they're saying I don't agree with. Was it Voltaire who said, I wholly disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it? I think, that's one of the foundational principles that, the United States was founded on in the Constitution, our freedom, our freedom of speech, that the government doesn't have a right to restrict our speech. I know there's some obvious exceptions to that, and it's and all that. Like it's since we're talking about it so much in the news lately, it's like you don't have a right to yell fire in a crowded theater, causing a panic. I think with that freedom comes a great responsibility, that we have to be very responsible for the words that we say and the speeches that we give. To understand that words have power. And as Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility. So I think that's why we need to take care and be cautious and be careful as we speak, but also to acknowledge that other people, though you may disagree with their point of view, they have a right to have their voice be heard. I mean, and it is good to be shown a point of view that you might disagree with, that makes you uncomfortable. And it's good for us to sit with that uncomfortableness because it helps us to think, it helps us to dialogue, it helps us to communicate ideas and maybe come to a better solution. Or it might even help you realize, wait, my point of view is wrong. I better change. Or maybe the other person will say, well, you know what? No, my point of view is wrong. Maybe I'll change. Or maybe we'll have to say, well, I guess we're going to have to disagree agreeably. But we seem to have lost that ability to discuss and communicate. I've mentioned that my political views have been changing over the years, and I think they'll continue to change. And I think on some level that's good because, I think the danger comes when we're just kind of rooted in one thing, will not change no matter what evidence is brought forth or whatever. But what I've enjoyed in this process is talking to people I disagree with and seeing if there are some common grounds we can find to, to move forward. And we need to be willing to sit with those things that make us uncomfortable and not just throw it in the fire and be done with it. Just kind of a little side trail there on this idea of censorship. Anyway, back to the story. Montag killed Beatty, and I've been wondering why. As this chapter goes on, Montag thinks about this, and he comes to the conclusion that maybe he's thinking that Beatty actually wanted Montag to kill him. I like on page 114 of my book, where after he burns up Beatty and escapes from the firemen, you have all this real tense paragraphs. He knocks out the other firemen, and then just a single line, and then another single line. It says, "They fell and lay without moving." New line, it says, "The blowing of a single autumn leaf." A new line, "He turned and the mechanical hound was there." And I tell you what, if that doesn't send a chill down your back, I don't know what would. The way that Bradbury uses space and just short sentences to get everything he'd been building up comes now to this head. And so he runs, and the hound is chasing him. He gets partially injected by the drug, but he manages to escape. Going back to that idea, did Beatty want to die? SparkNotes had an interesting thought on that said that Beatty understood what society had lost because he knew books and he was familiar with them, obviously. And there's actually one version, I think it's a stage play version that Bradbury wrote, that Beatty takes Montag into his house and shows him that he has a library. And, he kind of coyly clarifies that it's a crime to read books, not to own them. And so they just sit on the shelf unread, collecting dust. But you get this idea that at one time, Beatty had read them and he did understand it. And for some reason, he lost faith in what they taught, and he lost faith in society. And so maybe he did want Montag to kill him, and he egged him on to do it. Well, getting back to the story, Faber, he meets with Faber. Faber helps him escape the hound. He wears some dirty clothes of Faber's so that it can help confuse the scent of the mechanical hounds, who are just on his trail. It's so creepy. And so he starts thinking about if they catch him, will he have time for a speech? Let me read you this paragraph. It's on page 128. Would he have time for a speech? As the hound seized him in view of 10 or 20 or 30 million people, mightn't he sum up his entire life in the last week in one single phrase or a word that would stay with them long after the hound had turned, clenching him in its metal plier jaws, and trotted off in darkness, while the camera remained stationary, watching the creature dwindle in the distance, a splendid fade-out? What could he say in a single word, a few words, that would sear all their faces and wake them up? What a great question. What a great paragraph. He's basically asking, I need to have my my moment. I regret that I only have one life to live for my country, or some kind of dramatic, last line that will express everything he's gone through that will rattle society to its core and change its path going forward. I mean, no pressure, but you only have a couple minutes to figure this out. So what would your famous last words be? Right. Mine would probably be owie. Don't hurt me. I don't know. But you see that Montag has now changed, and he wants to see society change too. He wants them to realize and see what they're doing before it's too late. And so Montag is able to escape. He continues to run, and he eventually makes it to the river. He jumps in, and it says that he swept out. There was no bottom, and he was swept away in the dark. We get to then what we pick up on the second part of this book that I wanted to read, the second part of the chapter, that he is floating down the river. And I wonder if there's some kind of baptism imagery here, that he goes into the water. It's almost like he dies and then is resurrected when he comes out. But as he's floating in the river, he has this epiphany. He sees creation all around him. He sees nature all around him, and realizes, that he must never burn again in his life, because the sun is already burning everything. It says the sun burned every day, and this is on page 134. It burned time. The world rushed in a circle and turned on its axis, and time was busy burning the years and the people away without any help from him. So if he burned things with the firemen and the sun burned time, that meant that everything burned. One of them had to stop burning. The sun wouldn't, certainly. So it looked as if it had to be Montag and the people he had worked with until a few short hours ago. So instead of, burning and destroying things, maybe it was time to start saving and preserving things. I think a very interesting point of view. He comes out of the water after he has these philosophical thoughts and some life-changing realizations. And it says, he stepped from the river. The land rushed at him, a tidal wave. He was crushed by darkness and the look of the country and the million odors on a wind that iced his body. He fell back under the breaking curve of darkness and sound and smell, his ears roaring. He whirled. The stars poured over his sight like flaming meteors. He wanted to plunge in the river again and let it idle him safely on down somewhere. This dark land rising was like the day in his childhood, swimming, when from nowhere the largest wave in the history of remembering slammed him down in salt mud and green darkness, water burning mouth and nose, retching his stomach, screaming, too much water, too much land. Oh, and on it goes. It's such a beautiful description. It's almost like he's being born, right? I don't remember my birth, fortunately, but, it's almost like he's describing now Montag has entered a new life, and he is seeing the nature around him, the autumn landscape. And when he sees it all, he's breathing the air. It's fresh and it's clean and it's cold. And he sees animals and trees and all the beauty around him. And it says that he was not empty. There was more than enough here to fill him. There would always be more than enough. He finds the railroad track that he's supposed to follow to find the group of people he's searching for. And he knows that he's walking in the path that Clarice once walked in. So along the way, he sees a fire. And then now watch how fire has changed in its imagery. That before, through this whole book, fire was something very evil and wicked and almost cold and heartless. But now, as he says, it's not a fire that was burning, but it was warming. He saw many hands held to its warmth, hands without arms hidden in darkness. Above the hands, motionless faces that were only moved and tossed and flickered with firelight. He hadn't known fire could look this way. He had never thought in his life that it could give as well as take. Even its smell was different. So you recall the smell before, it was like the sick kerosene smell, and it made him sick. And it consumed and destroyed and murdered. But now it is giving life. It is warm. And I love the visual here where, and this is so true, you can see it in your mind's eye. The hands floating in the light, then darkness as it comes up to the body, and then above the light you see the faces, and it's just kind of a really interesting visual. So he meets some people there who are, the book people. They invite him into their group. Basically, he's found a tribe of booktubers. That's what I think, and people who have loved books and are like him and are like Clarice, who want to read and share the stories. And they tell him that you're welcome here. And he meets one of the men named Granger. We get some illustration of fake news. The government decides to stage this arrest so that they can look like they're in control, that they're in power, that their law is continuing well, and a fake video or a fake person is captured and claimed to be Montag, and he's executed or arrested anyway. He gets to meet some of the people around the fire. I think this is an interesting group. We've got someone who used to be a professor of the Thomas Hardy Chair at Cambridge. We have a doctor, a specialist, a professor. There's a reverend. It says that here he gave Reverend Padover here gave a few lectures 30 years ago and lost his flock between one Sunday and the next for his views. That I found that one to be very interesting because, today we're seeing that happen when, pastors and people of faith, they're often identified with one political party. And, I've seen it happen where they might speak out against something the Republicans were doing or not express, allegiance to certain former presidents, or we've even heard from some pastors recently that they say that they share what Christ says about turning the other cheek, and the congregation, some of those who really hold tight to that extreme right view, they'll say, well, that's weak. That's that's a weak point of view. Jesus should have been strong and mighty and powerful. Well, he is, but that wasn't the reason for his coming. But that's getting into theology, and I'll have to make another video about that. But anyway, it's where you speak perhaps even the truth, but the people you speak to, they don't want to hear it. In fact, that's a biblical principle. The Apostle Paul wrote to his protege Timothy in 2 Timothy that the time would come when there will be people who don't want to hear the truth, and they will wrench themselves away from the truth and follow after lies and follow after teachers who will scratch their itching ears. They will speak pleasant things to them, and they will tear themselves away from the truth. And I love how, that theme is, we can see that here in this, just in that little sentence, that little paragraph, that perhaps Reverend Padover there gave a few lectures that his flock didn't care for, and so he lost it all between one Sunday and the next. So Montag finds out that the book people, as I call them, as they're called, they have the books that they've read in their minds, and that there's a way that they've developed that can recall those what you've read. So whether we know it or not, we have the ability for perfect memory recall, and they figured out how to do that. So I thought that was so cool to imagine that every single book I've ever read is a part of me in its completion. And even if I can't recall the text, it's become a part of me. And it's so deeply ingrained in me that you can't take it out, without destroying the body. And so they found a way to keep these stories contained, or to keep these stories and tell these stories, is by essentially memorizing them or reading them. They've read them in the past, and they're waiting now for a time in the future when they'll be able to, they're kind of looking at it as, once the war is done, maybe we'll try it again and we'll get it right this time. And they'll be able to recite the stories, get it down on print, and pass it on to the next generation again. But I thought this was such a beautiful picture that this little group of people who love stories would gather around a campfire, or gather around in a small society and orally tell the stories to keep those traditions alive, which is kind of like they're going back to the beginning when before language was in the invention of writing, where they could put the oral traditions down on paper or stone, I guess, and pass on the stories that way. Granger, I believe it was, who said, "When the war is over, perhaps we can be of some use in the world." Do you really think they'll listen then? Montag responded, and he says, "If not, we'll just have to wait. We'll pass the books on to our children by word of mouth and let our children wait, in turn, on the other people. A lot will be lost that way, of course, but you can't make people listen. They have to come round in their own time, wondering what happened and why the world blew up under them. It can't last." And he goes on to talk some more. He says, the bottom of page 146, he says, "But that's the wonderful thing about man. He never gets so discouraged or disgusted that he gives up doing it all over again, because he knows very well it is important and worth the doing." And I love this visual that he says, you know what, it's time to move downstream. The war is coming. But then it says the other men helped, because he's putting out the fire. And Montag helped. And there in the wilderness, the men all moved their hands, putting out the fire together. And I think visually that's stunning, that they're doing this group activity together. They're putting out the fire together, the fire that, maybe symbolically the fire that's about to rage in the war, the fire of burning books, they're going to together put it out. That's kind of, maybe my thought on it, but I just found that to be very poetic. They continue to talk as they're waiting for the war to start and to end. Granger says a few things that I think were very profound. He talks about loss and Montag is saying, "I don't think I'm right. Something's not right. I'm not grieving. Should I be grieving?" Granger says that when he grieves, it's not so much for the loss of the person, but for the loss of the things that they will no longer do, the impacts they will no longer have on society. And yet, because of their what they've done, they've been able to leave their thumbprint on the generation that follows. And Granger talks about how that is a lofty goal to have. But I love this quote that Granger says, that his grandfather told him. He said, "Stuff your eyes with wonder," he said. Live as if you drop dead in 10 seconds. See the world. It's more fantastic than any dream made or paid for in factories." I love that. Stuff wonder in your eyes. Do things that amaze you. Look at things that astound you, live life to the fullest. Make every second count. So no pressure. Right? And so, maybe it's a good day. I'm going to put down my phone today and I'm going to spend time with my family, or I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to write a story, or do something that I can leave my fingerprints on. And so I hope you live your life like that you just stuff your eyes with wonder every day. It's an amazing way to live. Bradbury did that. I mean, almost to his dying day, he was busy and active and loving life and writing stories. And even when he couldn't see anymore, he had some trouble after a stroke, and he had trouble seeing, he had trouble writing. But I read in a biography that, he would dictate stories to his daughter and she'd write them down. And that was how he would write. And he continued to write. He wouldn't let the fact that his body was failing stop him from telling stories. And it's so beautiful. So the war comes. Again, we're going to skip over some more philosophizing and the descriptions of the war. But if you have any questions or thoughts on those, please do leave them in the comments. I am kind of limited on time to get this recorded, so I'm trying to hurry through a few things. I like what Montag says, that after the war, said it might take a while to rebuild, but he said a lot of it will be wrong, but just enough of it will be right. He's got some hope for the future, and I see that also in this other quote that Granger is talking about the phoenix. He says, "We know all the silly things we've done for 1,000 years, and as long as we know that and always have it around where we can see it, someday we'll stop making the funeral pyres and jumping in the middle of them. We pick up a few more people that remember every generation." So he has hope. He's talking about the phoenix is a stupid bird that builds a funeral pyre and then jumps in the middle of it and dies. But then from those ashes, he springs up again. He said, this is like our society. We keep doing the same thing over and over again. But over time, each time we get things a little bit better, a little bit more right before we go back and go forward. It's like, 2 steps forward, 1 backwards or something like that. And this to me is why we should not be so quick to, to burn or to ban like history books. And it's like, well, that history isn't true, so we shouldn't be teaching it. But really ask yourself, are you saying that because you don't think it's true or because it makes you uncomfortable? I think when that ties into some of the things we're seeing in our society about the very real history that we've had with racism and with slavery, that is uncomfortable to look at. That, some of our ancestors might have been slave owners, and that makes me sick to think about. And I don't like to be reminded of that. But if we're not, we seriously run the risk of doing it again. And so I think what Granger is saying is, learn from our past mistakes. Yes, they were mistakes, but learn from it and do better. And the more society progresses, the more opportunity we'll have, that we're getting more and more people to realize that those things were important lessons. They were hard lessons, but they're important. And let's learn from them so that we can, in the end, create a better society and do better into the future. So as bleak as Fahrenheit 451 gets sometimes, I think Bradbury is leaving us with a little bit of hope. So he then says that, as they watch the bombs fall, destroy the city, so many people just instantly die. And he says, and so they are now going to go back to the city to see if they can be of some help, which is so gracious on their part. The city that ran them out, they're now going to go and return to see how they can help. And Granger says, come on now, we're going to go build a mirror factory first and put out nothing but mirrors for the next year and take a long look in them. Genuine change can begin, right? It's just that illustration of we're going to make mirrors and we're going to just sit there and look at it for a while. We're going to have some time of self-reflection. How did we get to this point? How can we change and do better? It's not too late for us, even as a nation, that we have to maybe build ourselves a mirror and sit down and take a very hard look in it to see what future we're heading towards and what changes might need to be made. Because, I see things in our society personally that I find to be very encouraging, but I also see some thoughts and views that have me very worried. And I think this is a good idea, a good thought that, as a nation, maybe we need to just take a good hard look in the mirror and realize where we've been. And if change isn't made, where we're going to end up. And then the book ends with Montag remembering some Bible verses, which I thought is a very beautiful way to end this story. That he recalls some verses from Ecclesiastes about there's a time to break down and a time to build. It's the passage that talks about there's a time to live and a time to die. And then there is something else he read in Revelation, the last book of the Bible, and it says that on either side of the river was there a tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruits, and yielded her fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Yes, thought Montag, that's the one I'll save for noon when we reach the city. So he's going to recite that to the people, I guess to encourage them, to remind them. And I like how Bradbury is using that as an illustration. Without going into a lengthy theological discussion about the book of Revelation, that it's representing there in the Bible. It's that tree of life is found in heaven, in God's near where God's throne is, if I remember right. But it's like after all evil and wickedness of the world has been destroyed, sin and death has been conquered. And now the nations can find healing from this tree of life. And what that is and how it's described, you got me. I've studied theology, and there are just some things in the Bible that we're going to have to just put a pin in, and wait and see what it looks like when we get there. But the visual of this is one of hope. Bradbury has given us hope as the book ends, is that in truth, there is life. Montag is going to share that with the people who are left to give them hope for the future. This mighty, powerful book then comes to an end. But it doesn't, because every time I read it, it just stirs new passion and feelings and excitement in me. To remind me that how the importance of books, the importance of story, the importance of thinking and philosophy and yeah, even religion, how we can use that to help us be better and do better. So that's the end of Fahrenheit 451. I would love to know what you think about it. Next week, we will be looking at, if you're following along in the 60th anniversary edition, I will list the articles that we're going to read next week. I don't have it right here in front of me, but there's a couple of essays that we'll be reading. So go ahead and check the show notes. I'll have those printed there. And I should be able to keep on track now for at least a few more weeks. I'll try to let you know when I don't, but just be prepared that this might get a kind of a bumpy publication schedule. But anyway, I'd love to keep the conversation going in the comments. Let me know what you think. If you're watching this at a later time, please feel free to continue to comment, because it'll be here. So whenever you get around to reading it, that would be fine. All right. That'll be it for today. I've got to run, but thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't already. And make sure you read good books and tell great stories. And until next time, happy reading and take care.